The Subcommittee on Emerging Threats, Cybersecurity, and Science and Technology, and the Subcommittee on Transportation, Security, and Infrastructure Protection will now come to order. The subcommittees today are meeting to receive testimony on enhancing and implementing the cybersecurity elements of the sector-specific plans. I'll begin by recognizing myself for the purpose of an opening statement. Good afternoon, and over the past few months, the Subcommittee on Emerging Threats, Cybersecurity, and Science and Technology has held numerous hearings to assess how far-reaching our cybersecurity vulnerabilities are and how best to address them. Today, we will be focusing on the extent to which cybersecurity has been implemented as part of our 17 different sector-specific plans. We are joined today by the Transportation, Security, and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee, led by Chairwoman Sheila Jackson-Lee of Texas and Ranking Member Lundgren. Though this is our first joint hearing on the subject, I look very much forward to working with the Chairwoman and Ranking Member, along with my Ranking Member on the subcommittee on these issues in the 110th Congress as it continues. Although critical infrastructure protection is usually associated with physical protection of facilities, there is a growing realization that cybersecurity must receive equal attention. This holds true especially since the nation's critical infrastructure relies extensively on computerized information systems and electronic data. As we learned 2 weeks ago in a hearing on control systems and the electricity grid, many elements of our nation's critical infrastructure are vulnerable to cyber attack, in part because their computers are connected to the Internet. A cyber attack against a portion of our critical infrastructure could have devastating consequences that could cascade across the country. Similarly, an attack on our control systems could cause serious physical harm, for example, through the introduction of raw sewage into drinking water systems or through the catastrophic failure of critical electrical generators. One of the most important ways we can secure our infrastructure is through the implementation of the sector-specific plans. These 17 plans, one for each critical infrastructure sector in the U.S., are supposed to describe how each sector will identify, prioritize, and protect their physical and cyber assets. These plans are based on the high-level federal guidance in the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or NIP, released by DHS in 2006. The NIP is the roadmap for the sectors to follow when developing their sector-specific plans. The completion of the sector-specific plans will allow DHS to write a national annual report on critical infrastructure protection, which is designed to give us a general assessment of the security of our infrastructure. This first annual report is scheduled to be released next week. Now, today we will focus specifically on the cyber aspects of these plans. I have two significant concerns about the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security in this area. First, according to the Government Accountability Office report released today, many of the 17 plans are incomplete when it comes to cybersecurity. The GAO rated the 17 sector-specific plans according to 3 categories: either fully addressed, partially addressed, or not addressed at all, and found that none of the plans fully addressed all 30 cybersecurity criteria. GAO reports that many plans have no way of identifying the consequences of a cyber attack or reporting metrics of progress in implementing the plans to DHS. GAO concluded that without comprehensive plans, certain sectors could be ill-prepared to properly respond to a cyber attack. Now, the plans are supposed to be the easier part of this process, but if we're struggling just to get the plans right, we're going to have an even tougher time achieving true security. Our main goal, of course, is actually protecting our critical infrastructure, or at least making it resilient to attack. That should be the primary focus of our efforts. But as the first step, DHS must improve the current state of the cyber elements of the sector-specific plans. What we have now is simply unacceptable. Now, my second concern is with the implementation of the plan. Today's sector witnesses will describe the varying degrees to which they've begun translating their plans into actual improvements. It should be noted, of course, that the sector-specific plans were officially released in May 2007, so there has not been a great deal of time for action. While sectors have started implementing their plans, much work clearly remains to be done. Under the Department's current public-private partnership approach, I don't believe the federal government can adequately ensure the security of our critical infrastructure. Thus far, DHS has adopted a laissez-faire approach, it seems, toward critical infrastructure owners and operators. The sector-specific plan process is entirely voluntary, and there are no regulatory requirements attached to it. Many would argue, however, that protecting critical infrastructure is an issue of national security, a core constitutional responsibility of the federal government. Under this viewpoint, laissez-faire is arguably not the appropriate model. This observation is not intended to be an argument for more regulation or a criticism of our private sector partners. In a perfect world, we either wouldn't have to worry about security or would have an unlimited amount of money to spend on it. But this is clearly not a perfect world. The federal government and the American people want to ensure that there is a high level of cybersecurity protections on our critical infrastructure. But as Dr. Gordon notes in his testimony, private sector owners and operators have a hard time making the business case for increased cybersecurity investments. Recognizing that there may in fact be a market failure when it comes to private sector cybersecurity, I've asked the second panel of witnesses to discuss ways to incentivize owners and operators of critical infrastructure to better protect their systems. Some believe that with the proper incentives, the private sector can respond faster and more efficiently to future threats. Clearly, without appropriate consideration of all available public policy tools, the private sector's participation in critical infrastructure protection efforts may not reach its full potential. But I do think we need to look at a broad range of options in this area. I have great, though, apprehension about the current framework DHS is creating with the sector-specific plans as they relate to cybersecurity, but I am hopeful that today's discussion will be a valuable tool in trying to strike the right balance that will ensure a high level of security with a low level of government involvement. With that, that concludes my opening statement, and the Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for an opening statement.
I thank the Chairman, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, and Ranking Member Lundgren. Let me first say how honored I was yesterday to announce with you the creation of a commission to study this issue of cybersecurity, which will be has the top and brightest minds in the country on cybersecurity participating. It will be chaired by Admiral Inman, who is a former director of NSA, deputy director of CIA, a good friend of mine, one of the brightest individuals I think I've ever met, and Scott Charney, who I had the honor to work with in the Department of Justice, who headed up the computer crime and intellectual property section. I look forward to working with you in a bipartisan way. It's actually a nonpartisan commission that will provide recommendations for the next administration and the Congress on this very important issue. This hearing today will bring attention to the importance of protecting the nation's critical information technology infrastructure. And in response to the President's 7th Homeland Security Directive, the Department of Homeland Security has developed the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. It is designed to provide a coordinated approach to establish national priorities, goals, and requirements for all the 17 sectors of our economy that own and operate critical infrastructures across the country. Since every sector depends on a certain extent on IT systems and networks, it is very important that each sector's plan includes its approach to securing its information infrastructure. The sector-specific plans have undergone what some might call a tortuous evolution. Even so, it is important to realize that these plans are one piece of developing a common framework across the 17 diverse sectors. What this subcommittee has discovered in its hearings is that each of the 17 sectors is dependent upon information infrastructure in one way or another. Some are more dependent upon it than others, but each sector could be vulnerable to cyber threats and cyber attacks if appropriate steps are ignored. For example, a hacker could infiltrate the billing system of a hospital or retail store, or affect credit numbers or health information for a vast number of individuals. Now, this would inject the financial and/or healthcare system with uncertainty. Similarly, we've learned that earlier this month that industrial control systems could cause very real physical damage if not properly secured. We need to make sure that all the sectors are aware of their inherent interdependencies, and also that all sectors have critical information infrastructure, even if they don't think they do, that needs to be evaluated and appropriately secured. The sector-specific plans are the first step in securing this country's critical infrastructure. Again, Chairman Langevin and I was pleased to announce yesterday that we are participating in a commission to develop recommendations on cyber and information security policy for the next president. It is important to evaluate the actions of the current administration, build upon its successes, and incorporate its lessons learned as we move forward to improve our nation's overall cybersecurity. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation Security and Infrastructure Protection, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee, for an opening statement. And let me just again, as I've mentioned in private to the chairwoman, how grateful I am that we're doing this joint hearing, and how much I certainly look forward to working with you, Madam Chair, as we go forward. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me offer my equal appreciation for the opportunity to continue a topic that my committee, along with the ranking member of that subcommittee, Transportation Security and Infrastructure Protection, has continued to have a keen eye. And as I do so, might I just acknowledge the existence of the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. In meeting with a number of those from the private sector, we know that the work that we're doing today, the work that you've done, is extremely important and is an urgent topic of the private sector's participation in protecting our country's critical infrastructure. So again, I'm grateful to Chairman Langevin for inviting the Subcommittee on Transportation Security and Infrastructure Protection to participate in this hearing, and I look forward to our future collaboration where our issues of concern interact. Today's hearing regards the implementation or existence of the cybersecurity elements of the 17-sector Pacific plans, SSPs, under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. Ranking Member Lundgren and myself take particular interest in this topic, as DHS infrastructure protection falls under our subcommittee's jurisdiction. We have been and continue to be very vigilant about the Department's protection of our nation's critical infrastructure beyond cybersecurity, to also address physical and human considerations. Thanks again to Chairman Langevin. However, we will learn today about how the Department is protecting critical infrastructure from a cybersecurity perspective, and I look forward to seeing how the lessons learned today apply to other critical infrastructure protection programs. Thus far, I have been disappointed with DHS CIP efforts, but I look forward to learning more today and continuing the journey so that we can work collectively together, public and private sector. CIP is a massive and unprecedented undertaking. According to the Homeland Security Act of 2002, critical infrastructure includes systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination of these matters. Based upon this definition, critical infrastructure is not just bridges and water utilities, but also financial centers and transactions. It is therefore clear that when such a vast and important mission is combined with a young agency, it is incumbent upon it and its oversight committee to have frank and honest discussions about the efficacy of our CIP efforts. Protecting these systems and assets from natural and human-made disasters is exacerbated by the fact that approximately 85% of the country's critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. Furthermore, this administration did not encourage the government to regulate that private sector owners and operators for them instead to protect their critical infrastructure, but instead it encouraged voluntary partnerships. I raised that question early this morning about whether or not there needs to be regulation or should we continue in the voluntary effort. How well the Department manages this voluntary relationship with the private sector to protect our critical infrastructure is and will continue to be a major priority for our committee and my subcommittee specifically. Recently, Chairman Thompson and I directed committee staff to investigate the implementation of the NIPP and SSPs to learn whether they are motivating private industry to protect our critical infrastructure. Because such a large task is based upon a voluntary partnership, we need to give great attention to whether actions are indeed being taken. That will be the focus of my attention at today's hearings. And might I also say that I believe there's a great interest in the private sector to be engaged. They know that they have a large share of the private infrastructure, or the infrastructure of this nation. Then what is the vehicle, what is the formula, what is the structure that should be utilized to engage the private sector and to make this work? After all, we are responsible for securing America collectively. And this committee, the full committee, knows full well the question will be asked, maybe only of this committee, if the possibility occurs of a terrorist act in this nation. The release of the NIPP and the SSPs was delayed significantly. Unfortunately, the threat to our critical infrastructure was not simultaneously delayed. As a result, we have to quickly determine whether these plans are being implemented by owners and operators to better protect our critical infrastructure. It is not enough to create large, nearly unreadable documents and to discuss processes. Instead, we must focus on implementation and execution. For instance, we must have effective and efficient communication between private sector owners and operators of critical infrastructure and all levels of government. On September 26, Chairman Thompson and I sent a letter to Assistant Secretary Stefan and Director Cavalli about the implementation of the SSPs and the status of the National Annual Report that is supposed to describe the implementation of protection efforts. Based upon the Department's responses, we are quite concerned about whether verifiable action is being taken by the private sector. I'm not here to reprimand the private sector or to officially call for its regulation, but as I indicated, can we collaborate and can we work together? Because of the mission, however, I believe that all options should be on the table, and I believe that we need to give these partnerships a chance. We need to know whether the Department is executing them effectively, and what can we do to help make them work better. I believe the owners and operators of these assets will, in most cases, act without regulation if an effective case for action is made and there is adequate and necessary follow-through by the Department and oversight and the opportunity to share how we can do better. I want to learn from our witnesses from the private sector how the Department can be more effective in encouraging this necessary and urgent activity. It is now time for an open and honest conversation about protecting our critical infrastructure. We are done with documents and verbiage. It is time for action. It is time for us to learn about the tools that you need and how this Congress can be helpful. We may not need a regulatory hammer, but we certainly need a national discussion about civic and corporate responsibility and cooperation. I believe, Chairman Langevin, that today's hearing is the beginning of establishing that cooperation and dialogue on behalf of the American people. I thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman lady for her comments, and certainly about particularly the sentiment about our collaboration. I know that will continue, and I look forward to that. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, for the purpose of an opening statement. And likewise, I look forward to working with the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentlelady, and I thank my friend from Texas, Mr. McCall. First of all, let me say that I believe that the Department of Homeland Security did a good job in putting together the sector-specific plans and coming up with a National Infrastructure Protection Plan under the direction of Colonel Stephan. I know when he first came in, he was dissatisfied with what was then in works and asked us for extra time to make sure that we could put a good product together, and I think the department has. And I congratulate you on that, and frankly, it is a good piece of work. I am, as my colleagues are, dismayed by the recent GAO review, which did find that most of the sectors lacked a process for identifying the consequences of cyber attacks against their assets. That's probably not surprising, because most Americans and most in Congress look at guns, gates, and guards as the traditional means of protecting our critical infrastructure, and it's only after stepping back a ways that we realize the importance of the cyber world in all of this. It is my feeling that a public-private partnership is absolutely essential, not just because 85, 86, 87, whatever percentage you want to say of our critical infrastructure is privately owned and operated, but the agility with which the private sector is able to adapt in the area of technology is at least the equal of those of us in government. And we would do ourselves a disservice if we in any way followed procedures on the bureaucratic side or the regulatory side which denied us that agility, that creativity, and that ingenuity in responding to what are threats that change not yearly, not monthly, not weekly, not daily, but frankly minute by minute. So I'm very interested in the testimony we will receive today, both from the public and the private sectors, but I hope that we will find the way to reach that balance that is necessary between government regulation and private ingenuity and effectiveness. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his opening statement. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I now welcome our first panel of witnesses. I want to begin by thanking the panel for their patience and willingness to stick around for this panel. We wish you had a little more control over this the schedule around this place, but it doesn't seem to work out that way. I do want to begin by welcoming our first witness, Mr. Greg Garcia, Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications. Assistant Secretary Garcia oversees the Department of Homeland Security's mission to prepare for and respond to incidents that could degrade or overwhelm the operation of the nation's information technology and communications infrastructure. So I welcome you, Mr. Secretary. Our second witness, Dave Powner, is the Director of Information Technology Management Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Thank you for your participation and welcome you here today, Mr. Powner. Our third witness is Mr. J. Michael Hickey, the Chairman of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council. Mr. Hickey is also the Vice President of Government Affairs and National Security Policy at Verizon. Welcome, Mr. Hickey. Our fourth witness is Mr. George Hender, the Chairman of the Banking and Financial Sector Coordinating Council. Mr. Hender is the Vice Chairman of the Options Clearing Corporation. Welcome to you, Mr. Hender. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted into the record, and I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Assistant Secretary Garcia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairwoman, members of the subcommittees, thank you very much for inviting me again to speak about the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to strengthen the security and resilience of our nation's critical infrastructure. My comments today will focus on 3 areas. First, how my office has worked with each of the 17 critical infrastructure and key resource sectors to ensure cybersecurity is integrated into their sector-specific plans, or SSPs. Second, I'll report on the findings from our cybersecurity review of each SSP. And third, our plan for continuing to increase attention that each sector gives to cybersecurity. Under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or NIP, my office, the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, works to reduce cyber risk and enhance cybersecurity in 2 ways. We serve as the federal lead for the IT and communications sector infrastructure protection efforts, and as the lead for addressing the cross-sector cyber element for all sectors. Throughout the development of the SSPs, my office provided cybersecurity guidance and support to the sectors. This included providing sector-specific agencies with resources for identifying cybersecurity practices and protective programs, helping them identify cyber R&D priorities, and developing a comprehensive cyber guidance checklist which gave each sector a framework for integrating cybersecurity into their SSPs. In addition, sectors asked us to review drafts of their SSPs, and we provided recommendations on ways to address cybersecurity. My office also conducted a review of the cyber elements in each plan to determine sector-specific efforts and identify cross-sector trends. Our review was generally consistent with the findings of the GAO's analysis. In particular, I am pleased that the GAO found that 12 out of the 17 sectors were comprehensive in addressing cybersecurity in their SSPs. This is clear evidence of all the hard work that has been done to date. Since the development of the SSPs, sectors have been implementing their plans and enhancing efforts to address the security of their cyber infrastructure. Our review of the 2007 sector annual reports revealed an increased integration of cybersecurity considerations across the sectors. For example, more than half of the sectors identified at least one cybersecurity goal and/or priority. This is a significant improvement from the 2006 sector annual reports, and it's a strong indication of increased understanding about the importance of cybersecurity. Additionally, sectors are incorporating DHS-sponsored cybersecurity measures, such as our Cybersecurity Vulnerability Assessment Tool, into their risk assessment efforts. I would add, no discussion of cybersecurity and infrastructure protection efforts would be complete without mentioning the cross-sector cybersecurity working group. This group is composed of experts from each sector and serves to enhance cross-sector understanding of mutual dependencies and interdependencies. It's currently focused on addressing common cybersecurity challenges identified in each sector's initial SSP and developing improvements that can be leveraged across the sectors. Overall, while we are seeing greater attention given to cybersecurity, there is still more work to do. Each sector must consider its own cybersecurity posture and balance that against other sector-specific risk management efforts. Specifically, sectors should continue to focus on identifying their critical cyber infrastructure, assessing their cyber risk, implementing protective programs, and measuring the effectiveness of their efforts. My office is currently engaging with sectors that may not have fully captured the good cybersecurity work they are already doing in their initial SSPs. We will work with them to more fully document their efforts as they update their SSPs and develop their 2008 sector annual reports. We will also continue to work with individual sectors to implement the cyber aspects of their SSPs in order to measurably enhance security within their sectors. We will conduct workshops with sectors to identify incentives, cyber metrics, and current and future cyber R&D requirements. The development of the SSPs represented a significant milestone for public and private sector national protection and preparedness activities. My office is committed to promoting cybersecurity strategies that can address the evolving risks we face. We are thankful for the work that has been done to date, and we encourage all sectors to continue working with us to address cybersecurity in their infrastructure protection activities. Thank you all for your time today, and I'm happy to address any questions that you have.
Thank you, Secretary Garcia, for your testimony, and I now recognize Mr. Powner to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Chairman Langevin, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, Ranking Members McCall and Lundgren, and members of the subcommittees. We appreciate the opportunity to testify on our report being released today on cybersecurity elements of the sector plans to protect our nation's critical infrastructures. Chairman Langevin and Ranking Member McCall, I'd like to first thank you for your leadership and oversight of the nation's cyber-critical infrastructure. As the focal point for CIP, DHS has many cybersecurity-related roles and responsibilities that are called for in law and policy that we have previously testified on before this subcommittee. These are highlighted in detail in my written statement. One of these is the development of a comprehensive national plan that requires each of the 17 sectors to develop sector-specific plans that include how each sector will identify, assess, and protect its cyber assets. Today, as requested, I will discuss how well these plans address key cyber aspects of cybersecurity and GAO's observations and recommendations to move beyond the planning phase. The extent to which the sectors addressed aspects of cybersecurity in their plans varied. The strongest plans were the ones from the IT and communications sectors, while the weakest included the agriculture and commercial facilities sectors. The banking and finance sector's assessment fell near the middle of these plans. DHS has acknowledged these shortcomings and has stated that these are only the early efforts by the sectors to develop their respective plans. DHS attributed the variations to several items, including the maturity of the sector and the extent to which the sector worked with DHS to develop their plans. Nevertheless, until these plans fully address the key cyber elements, infrastructure sectors may not adequately identify, prioritize, and protect critical cyber assets. Another reason why these plans are incomplete is that based on our broader work for the full committee and for the subcommittee chaired by Ms. Jackson-Lee, is that some of the sectors claim that these plans are not that useful. In particular, some sectors believe that they have progressed beyond these plans. In these cases, then, this is just a paper exercise. It is important to note that these are just plans. They do not identify actual assets and vulnerabilities. Rather, they identify approaches the sectors will pursue. Moving forward, if in fact these plans are to truly be used to identify gaps in our nation's cyber protection efforts on a national level as intended, these plans need to be improved, meaning that they comprehensively address cyber elements, and even more importantly, the plans need to be effectively implemented. From an oversight perspective, it'll be important to track how these plans evolve and are implemented in the Critical Infrastructure Protection Annual Report due to the Executive Office of the President each September, although we hear that this year's report will be issued in November. Beyond its involvement with developing and implementing these plans, DHS's National Cybersecurity Division needs to continue to bolster its capabilities so that it is viewed as a valuable service provider to infrastructure owners. Today, this is not necessarily the case. To its credit, DHS's efforts to lead cyber exercises like Cyberstorm provide valuable information to participants to improve response and coordination mechanisms. However, our nation still lacks a national threat assessment and a mature analysis and warning capability, an area that we are currently reviewing for you, Mr. Chairman. If DHS is to effectively fulfill its role as the focal point for cyber-critical infrastructure protection, it must fulfill more of its responsibilities and build more capability. As our nation continues to progress at a slow pace in implementing this sector-based approach to protecting our nation's critical infrastructures. We're almost 10 years into this approach, and although there is some progress in areas, we're not where we need to be. Unless we start making more progress in actually protecting our critical infrastructures, we may want to consider alternative approaches, such as prioritizing and protecting by asset criticality, regardless of sector. In summary, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chair, if the sector-based approach to protecting our nation's critical infrastructures is to be effective, we'll need comprehensive plans. However, ultimately, our nation needs to move beyond the planning stages into implementation of effective protective and recovery programs. Implementation of these plans is more likely if DHS can successfully fulfill its responsibilities and become a provider of valuable information on threats and analytical products to our nation's critical infrastructure owners. This concludes my statement. I would be pleased to respond to questions.
I thank you, Mr. Powner, for your testimony, and the Chair now recognizes Mr. Hickey for his statement for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Langevin, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, Ranking Member McCall.
If you could put your microphone on there. Thank you.
Let me start over. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here representing the communications sector and to testify on behalf of the sector in terms of what we are doing day in and day out to advance not only cybersecurity, but business continuity and emergency preparedness practice within our sector. What I'd like to do in my few minutes with you is to discuss 4 areas of involvement. The first is focused on what companies like Verizon do day in and day out that really addresses not only cybersecurity, but broader asset protection within our companies. I would also like to spend a few minutes talking about the collaborative activity that's underway, again, day in and day out, not only within our sector, but with our partners in government. Yes. Third, I'll speak briefly to the Communications Sector Coordinating Council structure and the work that we're doing on our sector-specific plan, and I'll conclude with a few observations in terms of what I think we can do, what we must do with government going forward. Effective industry and government collaboration starts with the actions of individual organizations. The private sector owns and operates from 85 to 90% of this country's critical infrastructure. Because of industry's important role in national and homeland security, corporations like Verizon must dedicate the operations experience, resources, and oversight necessary to be as self-aware and self-reliant as possible. Verizon's communications, voice, data, and video networks are touched by over 100 million consumers and government and business customers daily. Because of this reach, we have a long-standing and growing commitment to national security and emergency preparedness. For instance, we've designed, built, and managed networks that are resilient and redundant. We have adopted best practice business methods and security procedures. We've created and tested business continuity and emergency preparedness programs. We have responded successfully to a wide range of crises and have provided leadership to industry and government organizations dedicated to national security and emergency preparedness. From a structural standpoint internally, we have corporate policy statements that require attention to business continuity, emergency preparedness, and cybersecurity. We have a number of senior leaders within our business, from a chief information officer who's an executive vice president, to a new chief technology officer, again another executive vice president, to the announcement of a new chief security officer for Verizon Corporation, who will start with us in January, who currently serves as Executive Assistant Director of the FBI for Criminal, Cyber, and International Security. We have groups within our IT organization that serve as service bureaus to all of our business units to make sure that cybersecurity practices are designed, engineered, and adopted business unit by business unit. We actually focus on security within our company from more of an organic standpoint. We rely on ground-up business unit activity, identifying and dealing with issues, and beyond that, to coordinate activity across our corporation, we have executive security councils and a Verizon Information Security Council that's responsible not only for oversight, but to make sure that best practices are implemented within our business organizations. We have a cyber intrusion response team that provides 7x24 coverage for the entire enterprise, supporting all business units and organizational points of contact to assess intrusion impacts, contain and control further dissemination of problem areas across the company, and capture and preserve evidence for law enforcement and legal purposes. So within Verizon Corporation, as within many other corporations that I work with day in and day out, there are strong practices in place. There's a real focus day in and day out on cybersecurity and critical asset protection within our organizations. I'd like to address just for a minute sector collaboration. Verizon and its peer companies within the communications sector have a long history of cooperation in national security and emergency preparedness. We have a 40-year history that stems back to the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the National Communications System was created to deal with issues of interoperability and sustainable communications. Since that time, in 1984, the National Coordinating Center for Telecommunications was formed. It's a partner organization with the National Communications System. It was broadened, it was established when Executive Order 12472 created it, and it has focused since that time on making sure that industry and government work together closely day in and day out on a full range of asset protection measures. The focus is on facilitating information sharing among government and industry participants regarding vulnerability, threat, intrusion, and anomaly information affecting the telecommunications infrastructure. I might point to the recent Southern California fires, where the NCC Watch took a real leadership role in coordinating private sector and government information sharing real time on what was happening within the field and how industry and government could respond together. That information developed there was shared with a joint field office when established on the West Coast. There is a Network Reliability and Interoperability Council established by the FCC back in 1992. There have been a series of 7 councils since that time. Most have focused on some aspect of security practice. Verizon and industry in general have been very active in working not only with the FCC, but with other government partners in advancing sound practice on a voluntary basis as a result of the work done within the NRIC. There's another organization called the National Security Information Exchange. In 1990, the NCS focused on actions industry and government could pursue to protect critical NACP telecommunications from the growing hacker threat. Ultimately, the NCS and NSTAT created national security information exchanges. These exchanges, since that time, have brought together expertise from government and subject matter experts on security practice from industry to address a full range of security practices relevant to the evolving risk environment. Pertinent to the Communications Sector Coordinating Council, I'm very proud to be its chair for this year, and it points out the complexities, I think, of working together not just within our sector, but on a cross-sector basis. And we have focused very much on our interdependencies, not just within our sector, but across sectors. The Communications Sector Coordinating Council became operational in calendar year 2006. It was chartered to foster the coordination of policy initiatives to improve the physical and cybersecurity of sector assets and to ease the flow of information within the sector, across sectors, and with designated federal agencies. We now embrace 35 member companies that are broadly representative of the sector. I think that's a real benefit for the Sector Coordinating Council having been established, because we're not just traditional wireline and wireless. We're satellite, we're undersea cable. We represent the national broadcasters, the Association of Public Television Stations, a wide range of companies.
If you could please summarize.
To summarize, the sector has been very proactive through the Sector Coordinating Council, through other mechanisms, and we have really focused on our sector-specific plan currently on the risk assessment, which we plan to have complete the end of this calendar year in draft form and in final form by end of first quarter next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hickey. I now recognize Mr. Hender to summarize your statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Longervin, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, Ranking Member McCall and Lundgren, and members of both subcommittees. My name is George Hender, and I am Chairman of the Financial Services Coordinating Council, also known as FISC. I'm pleased to appear today on FISC's behalf to discuss the important topic of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
FISC was established by the Department of Treasury. FISC is a private sector coalition of the nation's leading banks, financial firms, insurance companies, and their trade associations. FISC worked collaboratively with Treasury, our sector-specific agency, and with FIVC, our Government Coordinating Council, to craft our sector-specific plan. Our plan identifies 3 specific goals. First, to maintain our sector's strong position of resilience, risk management, and redundant systems. Second, to manage the risks posed by cross-sector interdependencies. And third, to work with law enforcement, the private sector, and our international counterparts to track and arrest criminals. The remainder of my testimony will focus on FISC's efforts to meet these goals in the area of cybersecurity. Modern financial services are built on a foundation of informational technology. Financial firm systems are a target for cyber attack because that's where the money is. As the nature of the complexity of attacks grow more sophisticated, FISC continues to implement a number of cyber-related initiatives. I'd like to highlight some of those initiatives. A year prior to the National Infrastructure Protection Plans released in 2006, FISC formed the first sector R&D committee. In April 2006, this committee published the Research Challenges, a report identifying 8 specific R&D priorities. An overarching theme throughout this report is protecting the sector from cyber attacks. In October 2006, the R&D committee published our research agenda to demonstrate how research challenges relate to the NIP. Together with these 2 publications, the necessary steps to produce a robust cybersecurity platform was formed. Another vital asset of FISC is the Financial Services Information Sharing Analysis Center, our ISAC. Our ISAC has been an effective information sharing tool in the fight against cyber attacks. Every day, our ISAC forwards cyber and physical security risk updates from over 100 sources to over 11,000 sector participants. Our ISAC also shares this information with Treasury, law enforcement, to help stop and prevent attacks. FISC and our ISACs have also been active participants in several business continuity exercises, including the congressional mandated top-off exercises. Additionally, ISAC represented PHYSIC in Cyberstorm and Cyber Tempest, two exercises focused on cyber-related issues. Our ISAC is also helping us to plan for Cyberstorm 2, which is scheduled for March of 2008. PHYSIC believes exercise participation is critical, and we encourage the planners of these exercises to include the private sectors during the planning phases of these exercises. PHYSIC has been an active participant in the Partnership for Critical Infrastructure Security, PCIS. I'm a member of the Executive Committee and Board of PCIS. PCIS has a working group focusing on cross-sector collaboration on cybersecurity issues. Many cybersecurity issues are ongoing, and there are still several issues to address. Two issues relate to the GAO's SSP report and the DHS R&D budget. According to GAO, the banking and finance sector S&P was ranked somewhat comprehensive in addressing cybersecurity. Because the GAO did not consult with the Treasury nor PHYSIC when preparing this report, I respectfully disagree with their conclusions. Our SSP included the research challenge document, which fully addresses the GAO criteria for cybersecurity R&D. For example, our R&D committee is identified as a primary mechanism to solicit information on R&D initiatives, and the research challenges report details the sector's goals and gaps related to cybersecurity. Examples in the SSP and my written testimony contradict GAO's finding that we failed to identify the programs to detect, deter, respond, and recover from cyber attacks. The GAO report also stated our SSP failed to describe a process for R&D investment priorities. But the R&D committee clearly identified a number of priorities where investment dollars could be directed. Without further guidance from it is unclear how the GAO reached these conclusions. We would welcome a dialogue with GAO on these important issues. Finally, PHYSIC believes DHS should consult with the private sector when funding private research. PHYSIC thinks it makes good economic sense to fund R&D industry experts and to use those experts to achieve this goal. Greater communication and consulting is necessary between DHS, Treasury, and PHYSIC. Another option would be to provide direct grant authority to the Treasury. Currently, PHYSIC can only influence R&D projects through comment letters. In short, PHYSIC believes that the DHS cybersecurity R&D budget should be more closely aligned with the level of threat. An appropriation of only $11 million is clearly insufficient. Our nation would be better served by providing additional budget discretion and dollars to projects identified by the industry under attack. Thank you for the opportunity to provide PHYSIC's views for this important hearing. I would be pleased to answer any questions.
I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony, and I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of questions. Mr. Hender, thank you for your testimony. You discussed the R&D piece of your sector plan and your information sharing and analysis center. What I didn't hear, though, was how your sector protects its assets and what efforts are underway in that respect. Would you address that?
Certainly. As I indicated in my testimony, our ISAC, on a daily basis, receives well over 100 sources of independent information, which it analyzes and then passes on that analysis every day before the markets open.
But that's information sharing. What about what steps are you taking? What concrete steps are you taking?
Well, part of the information that is fed to the 11,000 participants is, in fact, potential cyber attacks. They then take that information and use that information to look at their systems to see whether they have vulnerabilities. Also, attacks take place, and they are able to pass on to the other participants the attacks that are ongoing and how those attacks can be mitigated. We also use that information to pass on to the other government agencies to make sure that those attacks are taken seriously and the government agencies can use their best efforts to stop them.
Well, I think clearly it would be helpful to the subcommittee and for better understanding of the situation, more concrete steps, action, a set of action plans that they actually take, as opposed to just being notified and sharing the information. But what steps are then taken to make sure that the attacks are not successful and that security mechanisms are actually put into place. You know, I would have felt more comfortable. You spoke about intrusion detection devices and other beefing up firewalls and things of that nature.
Well, clearly, the members of PHYSIC spend millions and millions of dollars building just those things that you have mentioned to prevent the attacks. As we all know, these attacks are becoming more sophisticated every day, and the things that they have in place, which maybe were adequate a year ago or 6 months ago, we now know are not. So they are continuously spending money to make sure that those firewalls and other protection devices are in place to stop an attack. When those protection things fail, it's very important to get that information out so it does not spread.
Secretary Garcia, let me turn to you on another topic. The White House has announced a few weeks ago a new initiative called the Cyber Initiative. It's been said that the Cyber Initiative will be a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar operation which will help protect government and private communication networks from cyber attacks. I've also heard that the DNI will be coordinating this effort with over 2,000 people from DHS, NSA, and other federal agencies. It is extremely disconcerting, however, that everything that I've heard about this new initiative has come from newspaper articles, despite repeated requests for a briefing from DHS. Why won't the department brief this committee on the Cyber Initiative?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. First of all, we take very seriously our commitment to inform and engage the Congress on matters as important as cybersecurity. And along those lines, we are glad that we've had the opportunity to brief members of the committee on more than one occasion on the classified threats that we are facing as a nation, and particularly as a federal government. So the question becomes then, what do we actually do about it? And this is, in fact, many of the issues that I've testified to you about. We have a number of programs underway in DHS under my Office of Cybersecurity and Communications that are addressing this day after day. And one of the highest priorities that I stated at the outset of my tenure at the department was to protect federal networks, which are constantly under attack, cyber attack, on a day-to-day basis. So that has been well stated as one of my highest priorities. In terms of making that a comprehensive, holistic government program that involves all members of the federal government on an interagency basis, it's a complex planning process. And we would want to be sure that we have an accurate assessment of the way forward before we brief the Congress on this. The last thing we want to do is give you an incomplete or fragmented strategy.
Well, Secretary Garcia, I just remind you that this is supposed to be a collaborative effort, and both the administration working with the Congress, and when you're talking about this cyber initiative, something this massive, involving this many people, with the direct involvement, potentially, of the NSA, along with billions of dollars that are going to be spent. The lack of being forthcoming and engaging in full disclosure with the Congress, particularly with this The committee, subcommittee, it's upsetting, it's disconcerting, and I'm not happy. I'm not satisfied with that answer. Now, according to an article in the Baltimore Sun, the Cyber Initiative calls for NSA to work with DHS and other federal agencies to monitor critical infrastructure networks to prevent unauthorized intrusions. One presumes this would mean the monitoring of both federal and privately owned critical infrastructure networks. If this is true, what impact will this initiative have on the cybersecurity elements of the sector-specific plans? And beyond that, what impact will this have on the public-private partnership the DHS has been developing?
Sir, certainly I wouldn't want to comment on an article that is speculative before we've really finalized our plans, but we certainly look forward to briefing the committee at the appropriate time on when we have finalized our plans. But let me tell you that everything that we have been doing over the past year and a half or 2 years has been focused on this public-private partnership, and that needs to continue. My emphasis, absent the public-private partnership, is in strengthening our federal networks, and that really is one of the highest priorities, and that is what we're focusing on here. For the purposes of this hearing, the NIP and the sector-specific plan process is one that we are committed to year after year as we involve the private sector in our efforts.
Mr. Secretary, I certainly look forward to getting that the briefing on the cyber initiative at the earliest possible opportunity. With that, the Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. McCall, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair, and I would also like to raise the issue. We've had several hearings on cybersecurity, and Secretary Garcia, you've participated in many of those. It's my assumption that this plan that DHS is working on with the administration, you're in the process of developing that plan at this point in time. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Yeah.
It's an interagency process.
Right. And when do you anticipate that the plan will be fully developed so that you'll be in a position to brief members of Congress?
Sir, I wouldn't want to commit to a time at this point. We are still in the planning stages.
Okay. But certainly, if it's had been finalized, I can see why it's an ongoing process at this point. But I would ask, as well as to echo the Chairman's remarks, that to the extent when you are ready to share and coordinate with us on that, we would certainly like to know what the plan is. In addition, the commission that will be that was formed as of yesterday, I'm sure will be very interested in working with you on that as well.
Sir, let me just say I appreciate and commend you and Chairman Langevin for the appointment of that commission. I think this really shows proactive thinking about an ongoing attention that needs to be paid to cybersecurity and what is working, where are the gaps, what do we need to be doing going forward. So,
and I thank you for saying that. I think, as the Chairman mentioned yesterday, we see it as a forward-looking vehicle, not a gotcha exercise. It's a policy exercise looking forward. What can we do to better protect our systems? And I think you'll find it should be a very a friendly, not hostile relationship with the Department of Homeland Security and the administration. Having said that, I think, as you mentioned, Secretary, the 12 of 17, as I look at the report card, is actually some good news that we have plans that are satisfactory. There are a few that are not. And Mr. Powner, I wanted to ask you about some of those, specifically the financial sector, which has some concern if the financial networks were hacked into and the numbers were moved on the ledger. You can imagine the economic chaos that would cause. And we know that whether there are criminal enterprises wanting to steal, or whether it would be terrorists that would like to cause economic devastation in this country, you can imagine the consequences. So this particular sector is of some concern. Mr. Hender has raised the issue that your review is not as thorough as it should have been on the financial sector, and I wanted to get your response on that. Specifically, he said you did not consult with Treasury on your analysis. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, a couple comments. First of all, I'd like to start by saying, do we think, based on our years of work looking at cyber critical infrastructure, that the banking and finance sector is one of the mature sectors? We do, okay? When we did our analysis, we were surprised, okay? The way we go about our analysis, I have a very a team that's actually looked at this for many years, and we had multiple folks where they independently came up with the same assessment, okay? So we stand by our assessment. I think Secretary Garcia mentioned that our assessment overall was consistent with his assessment. So I think there's a disagreement not with just GAO, but perhaps with the DHS. Now, going forward, I'm more than willing to sit down with Mr. Hender. We've talked about this, and we'll talk about the differences here. I think the larger question here is this, not to go over check marks in this category or this category when you look at 30, is what's the value of the plans, okay? When some mature sectors, and it wasn't the banking and finance sector, but in other work we've done, the water sector, for instance, has mentioned, we're beyond the planning phase. These plans are not that helpful for us. And my only question is whether that's similar with the banking and finance sector.
Are you questioning the necessity for the plans, or the?
Well, I think, as you heard from the two witnesses here, there's a lot going on an individual company basis. And when you look at the whole sector approach, we've been trying to do this well, prior to, 9/11, the Homeland Security Act. This goes back to presidential directive in 1998. Okay, so we're almost 10 years into this, and many would argue that we haven't made much progress. We're still in the planning and assessing phase, and we ought to be into the protecting and putting in place robust recovery plans. So I'm not saying that the plans necessarily aren't useful, because they could be useful. It's a question of whether we complete them and effectively implementing them going forward.
And just to follow up to that, what more needs to be done to the financial sector to put it in the passing category? I'm of the view that mandates and regulatory action should be a last resort, that we should allow the private sector to work with the public to work this out. What more, in your opinion, needs to be done?
Well, in order to get their plan more comprehensive, I think there are probably only 6 or 7 criteria that they could easily bump their plan up, and they'd be one of the most comprehensive. So it's a matter of just making the plan complete at this point. And do we have confidence that will occur? Yes, and we're more than willing to sit down to Mr. Hender, too, to make sure that we didn't miss anything. But once again, we stand by our analysis.
Last question. I see my time has expired, but I'd like to ask Mr. Hender, how vulnerable, in your opinion, is the financial sector to a cyber attack?
Well, I would never sit here and tell you that a cyber attack could not happen against our sector. But I don't want to leave the impression with this committee that we are still in the planning phase in terms of cyber. I think if the GAO had looked at our full plan and the appendix that were attached to that plan, and if they would have understood that we are way beyond the planning stage. We're a highly regulated industry. And back in 2006, there was an analysis done by the Federal Reserve, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the SEC to see what progress our sector had made, not only in physical, but also in cyber. And I'll tell you, I would like to submit for the record the results of their findings, because I think you will find, if you read that report, we are way beyond the planning stage. We have done an enormous amount of work to protect this sector so that if it's a cyber attack or a physical attack, we are in as good a shape as we think we can be. That's not to say you can't be better, but we work at it every single day to try and get better.
And what is the name of the report you mentioned again?
The name of the report is a joint report on efforts of the private sector to implement the interagency paper on sound practices to strengthen the resilience of the U.S. financial system, and is dated April 2006.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully request that report be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I see my time has expired. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale, for 5 minutes.
Did I hear you right, Mr. Hender, that the GAO did not take into account the appendix of the report?
That's my impression. I mean, I don't know that for a fact.
Mr.
Because if you look at the appendix, it really answers the questions where they found fault with our sector.
Mr. Powner, did you take into account the appendix?
I would have to go back and revisit the full plan. I mean, a lot of these plans are quite comprehensive. Was there an appendix of the one Mr. Hender is referring to? I'd have to look at that.
Yeah, when you're looking at the chart, you're looking at the chart that you presented to us, the 5 areas that need really some improvement and are still perhaps in the planning stage as you go back before 9/11 this process started. Correct, Mr. Powner?
That's correct.
We're talking about banking and finance, defense industrial base, national monuments, agriculture and food, and commercial facilities are the worst, aren't they?
Correct.
Why is agriculture and food the worst, one of the worst, specifically?
Specifically, well, I could go through in detail, you know, those areas.
I read your testimony.
Right.
But you know that off the top of your head, what stands out? Is there one thing that stands out?
I would have to get back to you on that. I mean, we have the details here in an appendix for each of the 30 criteria that we looked at. But clearly, when you look at that with as many categories that were not fully satisfied, there are 8 overall categories. You know, do you have a methodology to assess your assets? Do you have a methodology to perform your risk assessments? There would be weaknesses in all those. Are there the appropriate methodologies for recovery plans?
Might not the biggest problem be here, to go back to something stated earlier, that we do not have a national risk assessment? What's the relationship between that, Mr. Powner, and the results which you've come up with, in your estimation?
A national cyber risk assessment?
Right.
Well, one of the things that's clear is we never have had a national cyber threat assessment, okay? So we have not had that.
10 years into the plan.
10 years in.
And we don't have a risk assessment.
Correct.
All right, let me ask Mr. Hender this question. Nothing changes under the sun. How are you verifying? How are you verifying what companies are doing with the information you provide? How do you know what they're doing with it? You're not just sending information. You're not just sending out an advisory. This is serious business, as you well know, better than I do. So what are you doing with the information? What are the companies doing with the information you give them?
Well, I've talked to the companies, and depending on the threat level, the company either has a problem or doesn't have a problem.
Do we have a list of what is done? Do we have a report to present to this committee as to what these companies are doing with the information that is provided?
Well, I think if you look at the report that I referred to earlier,
right,
that report is very comprehensive, and it also deals with the companies that make up the sector. And I think the agencies that regulate them, and we are highly regulated, these regulatory agencies...
You're highly regulated about what things are you talking about?
We are highly regulated by a number of things, but cyber is one of the things that we're regulated by.
And how are you regulated?
We are regulated by examination. And in fact, in some of the large companies, the regulators sit right in the offices to make sure that the things that you're worried about don't happen.
So you think the assessment that was made by GAO is just a result of them not reading all the information that should be available and is available to them? If they read that information, they're going to change their assessment. They're going to change the report. They're going to send back a report to this committee and say, we missed 3 or 4 different things, and we really want to change the banking and financial assessment to comprehensive. We don't think they're somewhat comprehensive. They're comprehensive. Is that what you want us to believe?
I truly believe that. And I think our sector coordinating agency, the United States Treasury, truly believes that. I believe that we're one of the most mature sectors that are out there. We take this very seriously. It's our business.
No one's saying that you're not taking it seriously. You've been on this for 10 years.
And excuse
me. You've been on this for 10 years, And I'm not convinced in what I've read and what I've heard today. I'm asking you to convince me. You haven't so far, you might. I'm asking you to convince me that there have been tangible actions on your part, not you personally, but in that sector that would indicate that we've come a long way. I don't feel that. What am I missing?
Well, maybe I'm just not a good communicator.
No, I don't think that's the case at all. You got to have something to communicate.
I think the amount of money that the firms have spent since 9/11 in making our sector more robust and able to deal not only with the physical threats, but the cyber threats are very, very impressive. As I said, they take this very seriously. Our regulators take it very seriously. And I think that I would be surprised if the GAO, when we have our conversation and point to them the real efforts, not plans, but the real things that we have in place to protect this sector, would not change their opinion. I would be very surprised.
Well, in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we're 10 years into this with this particular sector, and there's a very serious statement that Mr. Hender has made, that we respectfully disagree with the GAO's analysis. Those are your words, Mr. Hender, and I respect those words, don't get me wrong. I'm more inclined at this point, not you personally, I'm more inclined to believe GAO because they have a different part of this. They're involved in a very different part of this than you may be or I may be. And I would hope that you will prove to them that they are wrong, and so that this committee will get the report back, and maybe I'll change my mind, or maybe some of the other committee members who feel like I do will change their mind. But going back to what Mr. Powner said, we need a national risk assessment plan. And we cannot be honest with the American people about how safe they are unless we have that plan. And that plan is overdue. Is it not, Mr. Powner?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you giving me those courtesies.
I appreciate the gentleman's line of question. His point is well taken, and the chair certainly agrees. With that, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask both Mr. Hickey and Mr. Hender this. It seems to me that the nature of your industries are such that the cyber world is an essential part of it, an obvious essential part of it. It is part of what you do, it's part of what you are, it's part of how you provide your services, as opposed to some other sectors where cyber is important, extremely important, but it is not so transparent to the user that if you were to charge them for protecting the cyber aspect of their business, the user would say, well, I understand that. In your industry, it seems to me to be far more obvious. So I would ask you this, in both cases, how do your respective industries view cyber protection as a part of the cost of doing business such that your members can justify to your shareholders the bottom line? Because I happen to think that that's one of the most important things we're going to have to do in the private arena, and it would seem to me it would be more obvious in both of your cases to begin with. So I would say these may be the easy cases, but can you give me an idea of how the companies that make up your organizations view that as part of cost of doing business, and therefore the part of the cost of being active competitors?
When you take a look at today's marketplace, our customers, which are enterprise customers, government customers, and consumers, are demanding that companies like Verizon put in place safeguards to protect their business and their livelihoods within our organization. So the market is demanding that companies like Verizon invest very heavily in technologies that will safeguard not just our physical assets and certainly our human assets, but very importantly, our cybersecurity assets.
Well, let me ask you this then. You could look at a whole array of potential attacks. They could be hackers. They could be mischievous college students. They could be the bad guys who want to be able to get into your company and therefore extract some economic benefit on their part or to harm you so that someone else has benefited. Those, it seems to me, are, in terms of possibilities, greater than a terrorist attack, which is, has greater consequence, but the likelihood is far less. How do you calculate that such that you make a judgment to either insulate your operation from a cyber attack by a terrorist organization, transnational or national, or to create redundancies in the event that they are successful with an attack?
I think if we continue to focus on the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity practice, given the environment, given the fact that we're looking at an all-hazards environment, that we'll continue to invest as necessary in the technology and the expertise to help secure the interest of our customers. Verizon in 2006 invested over $17 billion in infrastructure build-out. And we are doing that certainly with an eye to our customer and our future customer base. And vendors that do business with Verizon know very clearly what our priorities are in terms of the technologies that we require to make our network more secure going forward. So again, going back to the marketplace, we're mindful of our customers' needs. Our vendors are mindful of our needs as a major carrier. And companies like Verizon continue to invest very aggressively to make sure that we are addressing all hazards within the cybersecurity realm.
Just parenthetically, I would say that if Verizon were one of those companies that we asked to assist us after 9/11 in our efforts on foreign intelligence that we're now refusing to give immunity, it's kind of tough for us to tell you to trust us as we go forward. Hopefully, we will address that. Let me ask both of you, and I know I asked both questions to you as well, Mr. Hender, but I'm limited in time. Do you have in the private sector, among the companies that would receive information that would be of value to them from the government, do you have, or do those companies have, their people that have the proper clearances that they could receive that information? And is it at the CIO level? And if a CIO has that information, has that clearance, how does a CIO interact with the CEO if the CEO doesn't have that clearance? And what have we done in terms of recommendations, if any, in your sectors to deal with that?
I think our sector-specific agency, Treasury, has been very responsive in getting the right people in our sector the necessary clearances that we need. And in addition to that, giving us access to the people in the federal government who are charged with collecting the intelligence information and passing that information on to us. You ask a very important question, though, and that is, what can the person who has the clearance do with that information? Clearly, if there is a life-threatening event that's going on that is classified, that person has an exemption and can pass that information on to anyone to make sure that those lives are not lost. Also, that person, with the permission of the agency, can work and make sure that the appropriate people within that company or within that entity know what's going on to protect that entity. It has never really been a challenge to date where something has come to our attention that has been classified where we have not been able to use that information to protect the sector.
Mr. Hickey, do you feel the same way?
Our sector-specific agency is the National Communications System. Just as Mr. Hender said, the NCS has been I apologize. The NCS is...
It's a question of communications, but I think you're getting a hold of it.
Thank you. I deserve that. The NCS has been very attentive to the needs of not just my company, but others, in making sure that we have the right clearances on the right, for the right individuals. I can say that from a Verizon standpoint, our CEO, Ivan Seidenberg, has just received his top secret clearance. So right to the top within our organization, if we at the ground level, if my team becomes aware of information shared within the NCS or within the information within the high track organization, within the IP division, we can share that at the very highest levels of the business with the appropriate individuals to make the right decisions from a response standpoint.
I thank the ranking member. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Security, and Infrastructure Protection for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I thank the witnesses. And Mr. Hickey, you're having trouble with communications. I'm having trouble with double appointments and hearings that we have responsibility for, but I'm delighted that the testimony has contributed to, I think, a very important discussion. I'm going to start on this debate that is going on with the initial offering to work with the private sector. Again, the private sector holds 85% of the infrastructure, and certainly cybersecurity being a seamless part of that. There's a dialogue going on about the question of the voluntary cooperation, which I made mention of in my opening remarks, or a regulatory framework. So I'd like to ask Mr. Hender, based upon your experience, let me pose the question first to Mr. Powner, and then Mr. Hender, you might want to comment. But based upon your experience in critical infrastructure work, protection work, do you think the Department of Homeland Security should continue to work with the private sector, or providing the private sector with a adequate value proposition to encourage it to effectively protect critical infrastructure? In essence, are we giving them enough of a carrot voluntarily to do it voluntarily, or should there be some form of a regulatory framework in this partnership?
I think when you look at what was envisioned in national policy going back pre-HSPD 7, one of the things that the federal government needs to do a better job, and Assistant Secretary Garcia and I have talked about this, if there were more products, analytical products coming out of the U.S. CERT, more information on national threat information that was of value to the critical infrastructure owners, I think that would improve the partnership. Okay, so in order to have an effective partnership, you got to be offering something that these sectors want. Okay, historically, when you look at where it's really worked, I think there were times when we provided grants to the water sector to do vulnerability assessments. That opened up the communications, okay, because the government was paying for certain vulnerability assessments, so they were more inclined to open the discussion. I think there's pockets of sectors, due to the maturity of them working in regulated environments, that are more mature and have worked more effectively together, like the banking and finance sector. So I think regulation should be considered if we don't make more progress. But there's also, if you stay the course with the NIP and the sector plans, the federal government needs to offer more of and provide more of a service to the infrastructure owners.
And that service in what form?
The service, the things that the government controls more when you look at the roles and responsibilities of the NCSD under Assistant Secretary Garcia, it's threat information and it's analytical products on vulnerabilities and incidents. Okay, we have a U.S. CERT that we continue to attempt to build out capability with the vision that we're going to have more robust analytical products that we can provide to these infrastructure owners. As an example, if you go to DoD or some parts of the intelligence community, you'll see some fairly robust analysis and warning capability when it comes to cyber, okay? So there are pockets in the federal government where we have this, all right? What we need to do is we need to build that out and transfer that information to the infrastructure owners. That would help with the partnership.
And the pockets in the federal government are just scattered, or there's some order to them?
Well, I think there's order, but it depends on where it's at. I mean, if you look at DoD and some of their capabilities in this area, some of it's fairly robust.
We need to harness it. We need to get some sort of organized way of connecting.
Well, absolutely. If you look at HSPD 7, and if you go back to analysis and warning, pre-DHS, we had this capability. We were building it within the FBI. There was something there called the National Infrastructure Protection Center. With the creation of DHS, we moved it from the FBI, and it now became the U.S. CERT. So clearly, we've had starts and stops. We've progressed forward. We've taken some steps backwards. But if we really want to build out that capability, that's one way to build a more effective partnership if you offered more on the government side that was of value to these sector owners.
Mr. Hender.
It is very clear that unless there is a partnership between the private sector and the public sector, the things that we have discussed today are never going to be solved. I think a good example and a model is to look at the partnership that we have with Treasury. It's so critical to have information that flows both ways. And if I could make a recommendation, I would think it would work very well and be very important to take people from the private sectors, just not our sector, but all the sectors, and house them in some form or fashion within CERT or some other intelligent organizations. So as this information comes in, it can be analyzed not only by the government, but you have the private sector sitting there and saying, this is important information. This is a threat. This is what this means, this information. Unless you have that partnership and unless you have those people sitting there working together, a lot of information that maybe flows into these intelligent organizations, I think we're missing a golden opportunity, and I think we're missing it.
We are missing. Mr. Garcia, Mr. Chairman, if I can, I just have a couple of quick questions. Probably not quick on the answer. It's Secretary Garcia. Let me thank you for your service. This is a tough business that we're in, and I think there's some tough concerns that we have as members. You know that I expressed my concern about the National Annual Report regarding the status of critical infrastructure protection nationally and within each of the sectors. The report is due on November 5th, and my question is it ready? Is it something that we can expect? And you might want to acknowledge whether this is still the case, that we'll have a full report. And I have another question for you that I'd like to just offer so that you can answer it. The incident at the Idaho laboratory provided you with an opportunity to showcase how effectively you can reach out to the private sector with best practices. My concern, though, is how you verify the implementation of these advisories. And I think this was mentioned by one of the witnesses. How do we have a two-way street? How are you measuring such implementation, and into what obstacles are you running so that the private sector can become vested in what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. On the first point, I believe we are on track for delivering that report to you. And on the second issue, you're correct that one of the most important things for us to achieve over time is the ability to measure progress. Where DHS is not empowered to compel reporting back from the private sector on the extent to which they have implemented best practices or other methods.
DHS is not compelled to report back to the private sector?
No, to the extent that DHS cannot compel the private sector to report back to DHS. To report
back. So
that's
there's
correct.
a lacking of either oversight or regulatory structure.
And for those sector coordinating councils that we have worked with, for example, they in turn are not necessarily empowered to demand from their member companies that they report back to them. So much of this is in fact voluntary. I think the fact, I would point out, the fact that there are, through this whole NIP process and the sector-specific plan process, the fact that there are 17 critical sectors that have come to the table with DHS and other sector-specific agencies without actually being compelled to do so is, I think, in fact, a testament to the importance that the entire private sector, sector-specific agencies give to this issue of the joint public-private partnership.
Quickly, Mr. Hickey, has the DHS given enough incentives to the business community to do what Mr. Garcia says is missing, which is to come back and report back on best practices? Apparently there is a a schism there in terms of being able to do this in a voluntary manner?
I would respond to that by saying that there are a great number of forums that companies like Verizon participate in, from the National Security Telecom Advisory Committee to the President, where you have 30 companies coming together from a full array of sector participants that come together regularly to develop plans and policy and recommendations to the President on global infrastructure resiliency, on network security, on GPS issues, on a full array of issues where we feel an obligation to bring our subject matter expertise to the table to work with government and support government initiatives. The NSIE, the National Security Information Exchange, where government and industry come together, again, it's voluntarily but willingly, to share best practice around cybersecurity and other security practice. My sense is that companies like Verizon are there because we feel an obligation to government and to the country to participate not only in planning, but in operationalizing security practice to protect the country's best interests. So we're there willingly. I think from an incentive standpoint, the issue of real-time sharing of threat intelligence is very important. And that would be that is helpful for companies like Verizon to have a good, accurate source of timely information regarding threats, cybersecurity and otherwise, that we can then internalize and deal with from an operational standpoint. Within Assistant Secretary Garcia's organization, he has made, I think, a positive move towards bringing together even more closely the information technology sector and the communications sector by co-locating our NCC ISAC, our National Coordinating Center for Telecommunications ISAC, with the IT ISAC and with the U.S. CERT. That brings us closer together physically, day in and day out. We can address, as things evolve, operational issues much more quickly on a day-to-day basis. So threat intelligence would be a major incentive, but I think there's a real willingness there to assist our government partners, and we are, I think, continuing to move in the right direction.
Thank you. I think we have a lot of work that we can look at that you've done that we need to do. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. There is a vote on right now, but we'll go to Ms. Clark for the final question before we dismiss this panel. Ms. Clark is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This question is to Mr. Powner. You just suggested to Chair Jackson Lee that the federal government could assist these sectors to ensure greater consistency through partnership, if you will. Clearly, there's a lack of consistency in the quality of the various sector-specific plans. Do you feel that DHS is doing enough to work with each respective set of public-private stakeholders to ensure greater consistency? And have your offices recommended or determined a good way for them to do this?
Well, clearly, Assistant Secretary Garcia had mentioned his office and the interaction they had with various sectors in putting those plans together. I think what's important is when you look at this next annual report that's due out, the annual report should be providing some assurance, Madam Chairwoman, that you mentioned, that one, the plans are now complete, and two, that we're actually moving down the road towards implementation.
Mr. Garcia, Assistant Secretary Garcia, good to see you again. In response to Representative Pascrell's questioning, Mr. Powner said that there needs to be a national risk assessment for cybersecurity. 5 months ago, the department stood up the Risk Management and Analysis Division. Have you engaged with that office to date?
That is part of the National Protection and Programs Directorate, to which my office belongs as well. CS&C is part of that, as well as the Risk Management and Analysis Office. So, yes, we interact regularly. The national risk assessment that we are focusing on is, in fact, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, the sector-specific plans that go with it. And I think as we implement these plans, as Mr. Powner says, we are going to have a national risk assessment with metrics in place that we can measure how well we are doing. I would emphasize that it's important to note that this is the first time we have done this, that 17 sectors have, industry sectors have organized themselves around a common mission, and then to organize themselves to interact with the government in a collaborative process, a framework by which we are going to measure the vulnerability, assess the vulnerability of our infrastructure nationwide, and then take the steps to actually mitigate those vulnerabilities and strengthen our infrastructure. So I think we have come a long way in just a year and a half worth of time. And the fact that most of these sector-specific plans were written around the middle of last year, there has been a tremendous amount of effort and resources put into infrastructure protection since then in the cyber area.
Assistant Secretary, I recognize that, you know, this is a major, major undertaking, and some would say just putting together the Department of Homeland Security has been a major, major undertaking. The concern is that there be some sort of a driving force that put some, you know, some energy behind getting this done in a timely fashion, and that, you know, we're not sort of leaving it up to inertia to get us there. You know, with each passing day, people are concerned that we have, you know, the critical infrastructure, particularly with respect to cybersecurity in place, because it seems like there's a generation of intelligentsia out there that just lives to get ahead of us with respect to cyberspace. So I hope that you will certainly recognize the urgency from which you hear this committee speaking, because we certainly believe time is of the essence, but at the same time understands that haste can't make waste. So we hope that you'll take that under advisement. And this question is really my final question, is to anyone on the panel. Although there are many differences between each sector represented in the NIP, and there is merit to the idea that each area tailor its own plan. When it comes to cybersecurity, many of these sectors deal with some of the same problems. For example, organizations in every sector have to deal with the possibility of data theft or that systems can be brought down. Therefore, if planners in one sector figure out a useful solution that can apply to other sectors, it would be useful if this information were disseminated. Is there any information sharing occurring between the coordinating councils for each sector? And is this a role that DHS plays or could play?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Thanks very much for that question. We last May set up, my office set up the cross-sector cybersecurity working group. And it's composed now of experts in cybersecurity from all of the 17 sectors. And we meet at least monthly, and I think more frequently on conference call. And this is the forum precisely for those various sectors to share their experiences in cybersecurity and see where there are dependencies on one another in their cyber infrastructure and interdependencies, and see where there are common problems across all of them. Control systems, a subject that this committee held a hearing on October 17th, is a prime example where there is a nexus between cybersecurity and physical security, that the process control systems that enable us to purify water, manufacture chemicals, to run the electric grid, all of these digital control systems have a nexus to information networks or communications networks. And so the fact that these sector representatives are coming together on a regular basis to share those concerns, identify common vulnerabilities, this is taking us a long way down the track of doing that national risk assessment that we're heading toward. And I think this is a perfect example of how the sector-specific plans, the NIP process, is working.
I would just like to comment that the Communications Sector Coordinating Council and IT Sector Coordinating Council work very closely together day in and day out. We have cross-membership. We work together in a number of forums. Actually, the chair of the IT Sector Council is in today's audience, so there is a very close relationship. As was pointed out earlier by one of your colleagues, it's hard to distinguish where pure providers and information service providers start. Companies like Verizon and other companies, large and small, are aware of the fact that with convergence of technologies, cybersecurity has to remain a real focus. And I can assure you that both within the IT sector and comm sector, we work very, very closely together.
I would just like to comment that we just finished a 3-week pandemic exercise. Part of the component of that exercise was cyber, because if the internet is not there, then the work-at-home programs that the firms have put together are going to be useless. It is our intention to make those findings public in 2008, early in 2008, not only to our sector, but to all the sectors in this country and to the international countries that are interested in learning the experiences we had during this pandemic exercise.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady, and I thank the witnesses for their testimony. There is one last thing I'm going to pose. Unfortunately, we don't have time for the answer since there's a vote on right now. We have about 2 minutes. But, you know, when we talk about the risk assessment, Secretary Garcia, and I'd ask you to respond to this in writing, and Mr. Powner, if you would comment. You know, a risk assessment is composed of threat and vulnerability and consequence. You know, how will the national report be a risk assessment when it is lacking these critical issues? So I pose that to you, and we'll have some other questions that we'd like you to respond to in writing. Again, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee, as I mentioned, may have additional questions for witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. At this time, the first panel of witnesses is dismissed, and the chair now recesses for what will be one vote, and we will reconvene in approximately 15 minutes. Thank you.